Uh, I'm really pleased to welcome a colleague of mine here at College of the Canyons. I'm in the history department here, and I don't know a lot about architecture, so I'm going to learn a little bit today. I barely know how a brick is made. But with that, I want to introduce Jason Oliver, Jason is professor of architecture at College of the Canyons, and he is also chair of the architecture and interior design program here. He's also a California licensed architect with over 25 years of professional experience. He is a LEED accredited professional in building design and construction. Jason began his education studying architectural drafting at LA's Pierce College in the early 1990s. And then he transferred to the University of Colorado, where he continued his studies, earning a bachelor's degree in environmental design and a master's degree in architecture. Jason's current academic focus is on infusing sustainable design principles into every phase of the learning process. I'm really excited for this talk today, and I know Jason's going to be bringing in some of his outstanding students. If you have questions for our panelists this morning, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to those as they pop up. So with that, please join me in welcoming Jason Oliver. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Brent. This is where we need the canned applause, right? So thank you very much. I appreciate the invite, and wanted to thank the organizers of today's event, the COC ISP program, for organizing and hosting the International Forum on Youth. I think this is a really wonderful event, and gives us an opportunity to sort of highlight a variety of different issues that we're all facing in the world, and particularly that are acutely faced by youth in the world. And so that'll be one of the emphasis of today's presentation. I am joined by two COC architecture students, Viridiana Gonzalez and Cristian Benoit Maldonado, who will be speaking a little bit later, and I'll kind of reintroduce them when we get to their part of the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen real quick here. So hopefully you can see my PowerPoint. So our presentation is basically going to focus on what I would term youth equity in the built environment. And it's one of those things that is all around us, the built environment, which is this sort of human-made, cities and buildings and all the places that we inhabit. And we don't really think so much about the role that youth play and the impact on youth that this environment takes. And as we start looking at that role in relation to sustainability and climate change, we'll see that, in many ways, the impact on youth is greater than on many other aspects of our population. The architecture and interior design program here at College of the Canyons is very much focused academically on sustainability, because that is and has been for several decades now the most important trend in advancing not only our understanding of the built environment, but the things that we can do to improve it. And so we teach sustainable and resilient design for the built environment. And so what we'll be talking about today are some of the aspects of sustainable design that are used in the profession and that address challenges, being faced by people in the world, and again, more specifically, young people in the physical environments that they live in. Now, youth in many ways face an acute shortage of access to quality education and access to things like mental and medical health care. And these are aspects of society that don't necessarily get impacted by building designers, architects like myself, or interior designers, but it is something where building designers do have leverage over other aspects that we can use to shape the built environment. And so with the objective of advocating for those who can't or maybe aren't aware of being able to advocate for themselves, our discussion is going to look at ways that designers can provide youth equity in the built environment, and in large part as a means for contributing to progress on what I see as worldwide environmental and social justice issues. So we often use the terms adaptation and resiliency when we're talking about, this sort of world we live in now that's faced with a variety of climate crises and global warming. And the terms resiliency and adaptability are used to describe that effort of survival that humans are engaged in. As we face an ever increasing number of regularly occurring crises and stresses that, in large part have been intensified by climate change and global warming. So when you think about the multitude of issues that need to be addressed both locally and globally, and this list just has a few of them that we face here in Southern California and that are shared in other parts of the world, it's almost impossible, it may seem, to be resilient in the face of these various dangers. And yet we have much of the technology, we have much of the scientific knowledge that's needed to address these issues. But what we often lack is either the sort of political or economic or psychological hurdles, which often stand in the way of substantively addressing these issues. And so when we talk about designing for resilience, the challenge of resiliency is very much connected to the physical world around us. And we often reside where we build our communities is right at that sensitive connection between the built environment, which we can shape, which is what we basically create, and then the natural environment that operates at scales that are obviously much larger and more powerful than we have the ability to easily and safely control. And so it's this tension between the built and the natural environment that exposes humans to many of the dangers that we face. And unfortunately, a lot of them are catastrophic and result in the loss of life. So what to do? Well, one of the things that helps us is to think about ways that we can sort of organize and focus our efforts. And so the United Nations has developed a series of sustainable development goals that they've broadcast to the world. And these are goals that can be embraced and undertaken by governments, on that scale, but also by individual people. These are things that we ourselves in our own personal lives can have an impact on. So to provide this structure for tackling global and local scale environmental challenges, the UN has this political framework that can guide us. And there's 17 different principles identified on this slide. And these are things that we all should, in our daily comings and goings, and when we're making decisions about things, we should keep these things in mind. These are all goals that we should be working towards. So for our attention today, we're going to focus on goal number 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. And specific to the idea of providing youth equity in the built environment, the goal is to make cities and human settlements that are inclusive and safe and resilient and sustainable. And these four characteristics of creating and maintaining healthy communities may seem very amenable. They may seem like pretty obvious. Of course, these are things that we should do. And yet we find time and time again that our built environment and all the sort of pressures that go into influencing and shaping our built environment are often at odds with these goals. And the disparities of providing these quality of life issues faced by youth are even more acute because they're now compounded by the sort of iterative repercussions of climate change. So as a design professional, one of the things I think about is, well, okay, I still have even a moral objective to move forward towards these goals and to try to help in my small way the quality of life for people, for myself, my family, my community, and everybody that are citizens of the world. So before we can kind of take action, though, those that shape the built environment, whether it's scientists or politicians or engineers or architects and basically everyone, we need to understand as best as possible the conditions that are and the causes that are endangering where we live. And so being informed about changing the world around us, one of the benefits is it provides credible and data-based scientific understanding that we can use in the design trades to improve not only the design of individual buildings, but also looking larger at the scale of cities or counties, or, when we talk about things like access to water, we're talking about scales that are statewide or much larger regions, that take a lot of thought and understanding of the science to make these things happen. So one of the resources that we look at in sustainable design, this is a website called CalAdapt that's funded through a variety, it's sort of a research consortium of universities across California. And what they've done is taken all the climate science research that's being done at all these different institutions, at the UC schools, the Cal State schools, and private universities, and they've overlaid all this data, and it provides projections on a variety of climate issues. So this particular slide, we're looking at sea level rise projections going forward over the next 5, 10, 15 years. You can actually, on this website, because it's dynamic, you can change the time duration, and you can also change the metrics depending on what are the projected sea level rise projections, depending on the data that's coming in. And so this is obviously really important for me as a designer and for city planners and politicians to understand, it's projected that within 20, 25, 30, 40 years, these particular areas of Southern California, this particular map is of the Long Beach port area, they're probably going to be underwater, or at least seriously stressed to be underwater, particularly during a storm event, or what they might call a 100-year storm event. So, knowing that maybe these are not the areas where we should be planning, huge, dense developments, because right off the bat, their location subjects them to dangers and to peril. So just simply knowing that might inform a decision about land use planning and where buildings would be located. Now, I think many people are obviously aware that the world is warming up. We have, climate science has been telling us that for many decades now. The same kind of scientific, technology and advancement that allows us to pick up a cell phone and call somebody in another part of the world, that same sort of science is telling us that the globe is warming. And yet it's something that is difficult for people to kind of wrap their heads around because of the scale and because it's so complex and so varied. But essentially, over the last 100 years, the Earth has warmed about an average of 1 degree Celsius, or about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. But we found that in some parts of the world, including much of Southern California and where College of the Canyons is located, the warming increases have been measured to be as much as about twice as great, or 2 degrees Celsius, about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And in some microclimatic areas, in some kind of smaller focused areas, the increase has been even more. So this global warming map that was posted by the Washington Post earlier this year shows some of these areas. And you'll notice that particularly the western left side of the United States, there's some areas that are quite extreme. So the Rocky Mountain areas of Colorado, and then even in the Los Angeles Basin area, we can see the colors are really dark reds. And so the temperature change in those areas is sometimes as much as 3 degrees Celsius, about 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a pretty extreme temperature increase. Okay, well, this is some interesting science that tells us that the world is warming up. Well, how does that affect us on a local scale? What do we do about it? So one of the things that we focus on in building design and city design is known as the heat island effect. And this is what in many ways causes these temperature extremes in specific areas. And so global warming sort of directly and physically affects the built environment through the heat island effect, where cities which have a lot of materials that maybe are absorbent of solar radiation, or that don't reflect that solar radiation back out into the atmosphere like ordinarily would be done on that area of land, that it ends up concentrating that heat and sort of through this cycle, increasing the heat of these areas. And so that's why sometimes in downtown Los Angeles, it may be 10, 15, 20 degrees warmer than other parts of the city. And it's a direct result of the heat island effect occurring. Now, we have techniques that we can use in the design industry to actually address the heat island effect. So if we look at on the right side of the slide, we can see some infrared images that show on a parking lot that's right next to, it looks like probably a park or a golf course or something like that. The areas that are in red are, the surface temperature of those areas are as much as maybe 130 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas the grassy areas, they're probably about 85 degrees. So we're talking about a really significant temperature change, 40, 50 degrees, just simply by the difference in materials that those two areas are constructed with. And a lot of us have experienced this in real time. If you've ever walked barefoot or tried to walk barefoot across a black asphalt parking lot in the summer, you realize real quick how hot that surface can be. And the reason that it gets hot is because as that surface is being bombarded by solar radiation throughout the day, the black surface, this dense material of asphaltic concrete, absorbs that heat and then sort of re-radiates it out, or through sort of conduction and convection, that heat is released rather than the radiation just simply bouncing back out into space. And so that's a really obvious example of the heat island effect on a small scale. So if you take it to the scale of a city, we can see on the image on the left, which is New York City or the Manhattan Island area of New York City, there's Central Park, which is this giant rectangular park in the middle of the city. And a lot of people go there in the summertime when it's hot because it's many, many times cooler than they would experience in other parts of the city. And so sometimes just simply the materials that are used can have a dramatic influence on whether the heat island effect impacts our community or not. Now, the thing is that youths, and often we find this with the elderly too, which is also a very vulnerable population, they don't really have a lot of control or the ability to shape the built environment around them. And so the consequences of heat islands and extreme heat are often experienced, sometimes catastrophically, by these people on a daily basis. So what can we do? Well, we have the ability to plant trees, and that seems pretty obvious, but the idea of urban forestry is a very important, very conscious movement taking place in cities to provide more protection from solar radiation. We found that reducing the heat island effect through shading, often provided by trees, provides a whole host of benefits. It develops a sort of a pride of place where you live in. We can see in these two slides, two communities here in Southern California that are, affected in different ways by the heat island effect. On the left, we have parts of South Central Los Angeles or the Boyle Heights neighborhood where there are not very many trees. There's not a lot of established foliage. And then on the right, we have, cities like Brentwood and Beverly Hills where the tree canopies are quite extensive. And, obviously, if you go to these neighborhoods on the same day, if you're able to get to them, let's say simultaneously, you'll find the temperature differential is quite extreme. And a lot of it is because of the cooling the cooling effect that the trees provide. So obviously people say, well, why don't we just plant more trees? But it obviously is more complicated than that. We can plant trees, but in order for trees to become mature to the level like they are on the right in communities like Brentwood and Beverly Hills, that takes many, many decades. And it takes not only time, but it also takes the people in those communities or the government, the municipal agencies that are maybe overseeing the design and maintenance of the street and maybe the median strips along there. They've got to water those trees and care for them. And that's a long-term commitment that unfortunately some communities have the resources to provide and other communities don't. And we can see that visually when we look at these communities. Another thing on extreme heat before we kind of move on to the next thing is that as designers, one of the things that we're looking at is making sure that we provide sanctuary in our projects, whether it's in buildings or in communities, for a place that people can escape from extreme heat days. So, we experience this sometimes in Santa Clarita, where it gets as much as 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And often people can, obviously die of heat stroke or, be seriously injured during those times. So they need a refuge where they can go. And so some of this is simply shading the buildings from direct sunlight, and then also aggressively insulating buildings but doing so in a way that still allows us to provide natural ventilation and natural cooling techniques for those buildings, so that if the power goes out, if we have a power loss due to a blackout or what have you, that these spaces are still able to keep themselves cool. And then what we'll look at is we'll find that there's quite a disconnect in how a lot of buildings are designed that don't incorporate these ideas. And in order to do so, buildings obviously need to be able to respond to the climate where they're located and to local site characteristics. So again, back to the idea of understanding the environment, we got to know a little bit about the sun. So one of the things that we teach our students is about the path of the sun. And so we all sort of intuitively know that the sun, we say it rises in the east in the morning and it travels across the sky and then it sets in the west. At least here in Southern California, that's the path it follows. If we were in the Southern Hemisphere, if we were in South America or parts of Africa or what have you, it would be doing the opposite thing. It would be in the northern part of the sky. But we know where the sun is going to be at different times of the day, and we know where it's going to be at different times of the year. And the sun's path across the sky changes at different times of the year. We're actually coming up on the winter time pretty soon here in Southern California. And December 21st, which is the kind of average winter solstice, which is when the sun is typically lowest on the horizon. It doesn't get as high up in the sky during the daytime. And so there's less solar radiation that hits that part of the earth, because that sunlight, that solar radiation has to pass through more atmosphere. And so it's energy, a lot of energy is lost in that passing through the denser atmosphere. Whereas in the summertime, the sun's higher in the sky, and so those solar rays don't have to pass through as much atmosphere, and that's why it's generally warmer. That's one of the reasons it's warmer in the summertime. So knowing the sort of geometry of how the sun travels across the sky, as building designers, we can take that into account in the design of our buildings. And so one of the interesting things is that it contributes to a sort of regional design aesthetic as well. And I think that's one of the sort of underappreciated or unacknowledged byproducts of good sustainable design, is that it fosters an aesthetic or a sort of design appearance for our buildings, regionalism. So not only should we be using locally sourced building materials, instead of transporting them, from other parts of the world, and the sort of carbon footprint that goes along with that, but also we should be designing our buildings to take into account the path of the sun. And obviously the sun has historically played an important role in the development of each region's built environment aesthetic. And that's often why many people enjoy traveling to other parts of the world, because you can see, different architecture, different cities, sort of a different way that people live in response to their climate. And so we're trying to make a very conscious approach to a return to that sort of regionalism. So one of the things here in Southern California, our latitude, our location above the equator of the Earth, we're at 34 degrees north latitude. And so if we were to put solar photovoltaic panels on the roof of a building in order to generate electricity, we'd probably, at least theoretically, want to put those at the same angle as our latitude, about 34 degrees north. Versus another part of the world. So if we were down in, let's say, Mexico City, which is south of us, we'd want those solar panels at a shallower slope, because they're at about 19 degrees north latitude above the equator. Versus if we were further north, maybe if we were up in Vancouver or Seattle, Washington, or a location like that, we'd need a much steeper slope, because in those parts of the globe, the sun's angle doesn't travel as high. It's much shallower. That's why those areas are typically colder, versus when we get to the equator, it's generally a warmer climate. And so just the influence on the angle of our roofs or the angle of our solar panels should play a role in the aesthetics of our building. Now in Southern California, we actually don't generally put solar panels at 34 degrees above the horizontal. We typically put them a little bit shallower angle, but that has more to do with the times of the year when we use the most electricity, which is during the summertime when it's hottest out and we need to cool our buildings. We want to get as much energy from the solar panels during those times. So again, the summer sun is at a higher altitude, and so we want to angle our panels as close to perpendicular as we can. So this sort of ability to inform the aesthetics of the building through sustainable building practices is sort of a really inexpensive method for contributing to the pride of place while still helping to solve some of the climate change issues that we're facing. Unfortunately, what we often see in a lot of communities, this being sort of an abstract representation of a typical house we might see here in Southern California, as you can see the sort of deficiencies when we start talking about things like solar exposure, that many houses, they have a roof, but that roof really doesn't do a lot to protect the building significantly from the solar radiation. Often we want to stop the solar rays before they even get a chance to hit the house. And a lot of these buildings, because of economic reasons or, maybe just sort of the momentum of the building design industry, houses tend to look a certain way because that's what people are used to. That's what they want to buy. There's a predictability to a housing developer building tracts of housing like this, but they don't really do much from a sustainable design standpoint. They don't really protect the building from the heat of the summertime, and they don't really do much to combat extreme heat days. And so there's a lot of just simple architectural things that we can do to modify the shell of the building, the envelope of the building, to start addressing and increasing the performance of these projects. We could simply plant trees out, in front of houses, and I think that would go a long way to improving the performance of our buildings. But obviously, we've got to know where the sun's going to be traveling in order to know where to put the trees, not just sort of randomly placing trees. We've got to be strategic on where we place them and making sure that we use the right species that are either indigenous or native to the area, so that they are used to the the sort of weather patterns and the access to water, versus other trees that maybe use up a lot of water, which is a critical issue for our climate. One of the areas of the world that I like to look at for inspiration is down in Australia. They have a really aggressive sustainable design program in both residential and commercial buildings. So this project we're looking at here is an example of a residential house that not only uses the roof as a means for shading the building, but they've actually created a shallow pond of water to help with to act as a convective cooling source for air that's going to be flowing into the house to help ventilate the building. And so this is a really interesting aesthetic or look for a building that's in response to the environment or the climate that it's located in. I also like the fact that this type of architecture creates what we call layered spaces. So we often think of our house, or whatever building we live in, maybe it's an apartment or condo or single family residence, and then there's a sort of landscape area or a yard, if you will, and it's sort of a separate thing. But we're seeing a lot of blurring between those kind of indoor and outdoor spaces. And again, they can be located and they can be positioned to take into account the path of the sun, so that we can provide more shading for people, when they are in those outdoor areas. And we can also use these spaces as areas for children to have a sort of safe zone, where they can spend more time outdoors, maybe outside of the house, but in a sort of safer environment, and provide what we call defensible space that you can kind of monitor. It's not just simply kids are kind of out of view, but that these spaces are part of the environment, the residential environment that these people live in. Another important topic that we look at in sustainable design that affects everybody that occupies the inside of the building is biophilia, or this sort of connection and the balance that we have or should have between the natural and the built environments. And we kind of got away from the idea of nature being a part of our everyday lives, because it's difficult to control in the way that we can control things using artificial air conditioning or sterile environments that don't have plants and animals in them. But there's a lot that's lost by not having this connection to nature. And so biophilia is the movement to really help reintegrate nature into our daily lives. And I think it's over the last 18 months or 2 years, particularly as the pandemic's been here, we've begun to realize how vulnerable we've become because we live in these sort of sterile environments. And that some of the studies that have been done relative to COVID have found that communities where people were in much closer connection to nature on a regular basis, maybe they were in agricultural communities or whatnot, that they often had a resiliency that didn't exist for people that lived in more sterile environments. And so anytime that we can sort of blend together the natural biome or the natural plant and animal life of a community, even if it's in an urban context, that's something that's going to benefit people. And of course, we have to understand what is the animal and plant life that exists in that area or did exist in that area or that would thrive in that area, so we can make sure that we're informed about what types of plants that we should be incorporating into our architecture and into our city design. Urban farming is another interesting one, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of biophilia, because obviously if we're able to plant things, we obviously plant vegetation for decorative reasons on projects, but what if we can get more out of that vegetation and that plant life than just simply decorative things that suck up, water? What if it, was urban farming, or, the ability for the residents of a development to garden? And this provides a whole host of benefits. Number one, it provides a sort of resiliency. There's that term resiliency again, against food scarcity. Now, you can only plant so much food, obviously, in a given area, but if people have access to food on their property that they themselves maybe have grown or at least have access to, that's not only a sort of meaningful and substantive connection to the natural world, but it provides some sort of a safety blanket in the case of if they're not able to get to the store, or they're maybe there's a natural disaster like an earthquake or a fire, and they simply can't get to access to food. They would at least have a reserve of food that might hold them over for a day or two. And we kind of saw this during the early parts of the pandemic, where there was a hesitancy for people to even leave their homes, and being able to access food is an important one. This idea of urban farming, of course, also contributes to a connection to the community, sort of a pride of place that people may have about where they live. If they've grown these plants, they've grown this food, they're going to obviously have more invested in it. And it, also is something that helps address the heat island effect. The other thing that goes along with this, one of the things that we've been looking at, even here at College of the Canyons, the idea of food waste diversion. So, obviously when you're growing things like this, you have maybe organic matter like leaves, and you're going to have leftover, food products and whatnot. What do you do with it? Well, ideally you should compost it, break it down to the organic nutrients that can then be used as fertilizer for on-site for the next round of plants or the next planting. And that obviously helps locally, but also diverts or reduces the amount of waste that goes into landfills. And so that is, on a community scale, something that we can do to help out. And so one of the things that we look at, or a notion that in sustainable design is trying to work towards, is the idea that collecting our waste materials, whether it's organic waste like we might find from an urban farm, or if you look at the trash bin or the recycling bin, or all these things that we kind of throw away on a daily basis, that a waste hauler comes and takes away, how can we maybe make that waste and sort of harvest it, and for things like packaging to become biodegradable, maybe those are things that can be compostable. And instead of throwing these resources away, they simply get channeled into a different resource stream. So those are some things that, as designers, when we look at products that we may be specifying, materials for a building, we got to look beyond just simply what is ordinarily done, but thinking on the scale of these sort of resource cycles. The other thing about urban farming and planting native plant species is, irrespective of whether they're edible or not, we've got to make sure that we support pollinators for our communities. We're not the only living organisms in our cities. There's plant life and animal life. And so things like bees and butterflies and birds and this whole cycle of the environment needs to be accommodated in our cities in order for the various scales of life to exist healthfully. And it all comes back to, supporting our resiliency, our ability to survive in the long term. Water is obviously a really important item. And interestingly, the water scarcity it's sort of a crisis that's unfolding right in front of us. Most people really aren't aware, or they're sort of unaffected or seemingly unaffected by the challenges that our communities are already facing to provide water for our daily survival. We sort of turn the faucet on and we get safe, clean drinking water and don't think much past that. But as we can see in this map, even though the world is covered by a lot of water, there's very little water that's suitable for drinking. I actually just read a statistic yesterday that 80% of the world's drinkable water is located down in Antarctica. So that means there's only 20% that's elsewhere. And a lot of that's probably up in the Arctic. And then when you look at the areas where people actually reside, there's not a lot of water available to us. So part of water is not just simply having water, but it's got to be drinkable water. It's got to be safe and non-toxic. And so water that's suitable for drinking is called potable water. And it's interesting because it's probably one of the most salient luxuries that we enjoy, I know, in the United States and in some other parts of the world. And our sort of unquestionable easy access to potable water is something that most people don't really think about until maybe they travel to another part of the world, or they're faced with a natural disaster like an earthquake or a fire, where their ability to access safe drinking water is put in jeopardy. And then you realize how important and how critical water is to our very survival. We simply need it every single day and in large volumes of it. And it's not as simple as it seems to be able to acquire that water. Now, a lot of major cities like those we have here in California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, interestingly, we have an abundance of water like we saw on that global map, right near us. We have the Pacific Ocean, which is, just miles away basically. And so there's sort of this inquisitiveness about, well, why don't we take that water and make it potable water, And so there's a process called desalination that extracts, the things from water, the salt and the brine and other things to make it suitable for drinking. But the problem with that is a tremendous amount of energy used in that process. And then what do you do with these byproducts that come from that? A lot of times they're pumped right back out into the ocean, which then sort of negatively impacts the aquatic ecosystems, which then has a sort of downward spiraling effect on the ecology of the area. So it's not as simple as just sort of saying desalinating. It's sort of analogous to the prospects of using nuclear energy generation. Back in the 1950s, it seemed wonderful. We could get limitless amounts of energy, but it didn't really look beyond the immediate benefits. It didn't look at, well, what do we do with this radioactive material that is going to take many, many thousands of centuries before it's no longer dangerous. And sort of the same thing with desalination. So instead of turning towards desalination as a sort of magical remedy for our chronic overuse of water resources and the sort of dangerous water shortages that we face, and we don't always sort of know that we face them, but they're there, is we need to learn more and sort of emulate some of the water reuse strategies that other societies have done over the centuries, and the way that other societies are managing their limited water resources. And again, that's something where I looked at Australia, and they're extremely aggressive on water reclamation. After they've used water, how do they capture it and then reuse it time and time again? And so our future survival as regards water use and consumption is going to probably involve reducing and potentially eliminating the idea of sort of decorative landscaping and using less water for non-essential things like washing our cars, on a regular basis. And if we look at communities like Las Vegas, where they already have sort of manifested this sort of police supervision of water abuse, and we may start seeing that more and more here in Southern California. And of course, it's going to affect the appearance of our built environment. But if we embrace it and then look at other benefits we can get by getting away from decorative landscaping and find more purposeful landscaping that can address some of these other issues like heat-on effect and food scarcity, then we can have a more sustainable and resilient future. Obviously looking for opportunities to capture what little rainwater we get, filtering it. And then, one of the things that we're looking at on projects, building projects is recycling water in the project, that comes out of sinks, non-toxic sources. So not necessarily water that comes out of toilets and things like that. I mean, that's technology that is a little too advanced right now for most projects to incorporate. But things like hand washing sinks, showers, laundry machines, we can filter that water relatively easy and then reuse it again on site for other purposes. So looking ahead, another technique that we're using in sustainable design, again, is to reduce the sort of energy footprint of a building, the energy consumption of a building, is how can we naturally ventilate our spaces. And so this interesting project on the right is it's an apartment building in Kenya that's naturally ventilated. So they don't have air conditioning units in the way that we would here in the United States, basically. But in order to have a project that's comfortable for people to live in, there's a lot of things we got to consider about the location of the building, the way it's oriented on the site, understanding how the sun's going to travel, providing good solar shading. You can see on the image on the right, there's this sort of lattice work of, it's actually a concrete structural screen that not only helps support the building, but it provides shading for the building surfaces. And so when we take, considerations in mind like natural ventilation and cooling and lighting a building, these are sort of the fundamental characteristics that we as architects and interior designers can use to reduce the environmental impact of a building. So you can see on the right, these are studies, solar studies that were done as part of the design of that project to understand, how would the sun impact the building and how should it be shaded so that they could let natural daylight in, but to stop the direct solar radiation so it doesn't overheat the building. So it just takes a little bit of understanding of geometry and the way that the sun travels, and then designing the building, given those considerations. Now, as part of naturally ventilating a building, which seems really obvious, a lot of us live in, let's say, homes or apartments or whatnot, where you can just open windows and you can naturally ventilate a building. But when it's done right, it can often cool the building down as well. And it also provides a really important thing, which is access to natural light. And our connection to nature goes in a lot of different ways. And one of them is through this circadian rhythms. Our body sort of knows or needs to know when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. And our overall well-being is tied to that sort of that rhythm of the daily path of the sun. The other thing that's interesting, that they've done studies on natural ventilated buildings, is that the psychrometrics of the occupants, in other words, the sort of comfort level, the measure of the people's comfort, is actually much broader if the building has access to fresh outdoor air, and that the people can control that ventilation. That they can open or close windows or adjust vents or whatever means are being used to naturally ventilate the building, that people are willing and are comfortable in a much broader range of temperatures. So we don't have to have artificial air conditioning, and if we can get away with it and still provide a comfortable and a nice environment for people. But of course, people need to know how to sort of control those interior environments. They need to know if there's shading devices that have to be adjusted throughout the day to limit the amount of solar radiation. They've got to be able to sort of do that and understand how they can get the most natural light while reducing the excessive solar gain. So this is an interesting project. Again, this is an interesting one in Australia. I go there a lot for examples of, sort of how can we bring all these different ideas together in sustainable design as designers, and still address all the other issues that we have to have for a building, to occupy the spaces that people need, to have a building that's, stands up, and has access to water, and all the different considerations that are building. And now we have to think about how can we do this in a way that's carbon neutral or carbon negative, so that this building isn't reliant on burning fossil fuels. And it's pretty challenging, but there's a lot of tools that we can use, some of which we've talked about, to do this. And it involves not just the design of the building individually, but where's that building located in the city? Are they going to have access to maybe public transit, or are they going to have to rely on single-use occupancy vehicles? Where's their water source going to come from? How is the energy generated for this building? Where's that going to come from? Is it going to be generated on site? How much of that energy is going to be conserved? Or is it going to be coming from some sort of a utility scale, energy generation facility? Is it a solar farm, a wind farm, or is it a coal-fired power plant? So all these different scales of considerations go into the carbon footprint of a project. And what's kind of unfortunate is that a lot of societies don't have the sort of resources available to make these decisions. We often have all the scientific knowledge, we have a lot of the sort of wealth to put this stuff in practice, but often we have other hurdles, psychological hurdles or political hurdles in the way that don't allow us to sort of decarbonize our society as easily as we'd like to. It's going to be a long process, but it's something that we got to move towards. We've got to create walkable cities. We've got to create and invest in public transit. And looking at some of these other examples from around the world, not only inspires us, but gives us some real tangible solutions that we can emulate. So along with that, as my part of the presentation starts coming to a conclusion here, and I'll pass the baton off to Viridiana and Cristian in a moment, is that even as designers, we need to do, part of our sort of data collection about the designs of buildings that we're generating is we need to start modeling and simulating things like the path of the sun, the natural ventilation of a building, the energy consumption of the building, so that we can simulate these things, and then through an iterative design process, a sort of design process or a problem-solving process that's informed by this data. And as we make tweaks, we run the simulations again, and we can see, is that improving or decreasing the efficiency, let's say, of the natural ventilation, and we can further improve the building performance as we're going through this process. But it's going to often require us to embrace sort of non-traditional solutions to buildings. Buildings aren't going to look necessarily like that tract house that we saw in Santa Clarita. It might look quite a bit different in order to be a green building or a net carbon zero building. And so in a moment, Viridiana and Cristian will talk to us about a project that they're working on in collaboration with the college in El Salvador on a sustainable residential design. So we talked a little bit about the United Nations goals. Another sort of metric that we use in sustainable design is called the quadruple bottom line, and it's sort of the blending or the balancing of these different sort of seemingly opposite forces. And so the obvious ones is we've got to take care of the environment or a planet, otherwise it won't be suitable for life. We've got to take care of people, the social issues that we've got to support each other, and then there's of course economic issues or a profitability, not in the sense of maybe Elon Musk making one person having a certain percentage of the entire world's wealth, but that all of us become profitable and have a certain safety that comes from that. And then also this fourth characteristic is the purpose, that there's a sort of spirituality, whether it's religious or some other form, that we have strong cultural and aesthetic ties, and that our lives have purpose, while accomplishing these other goals for our survival. And so I think that this quadruple bottom line is more than just sort of a standard that we need to judge decisions by, but it's kind of a right. When we look at the youth and the elderly in the world, that when we're striving to improve the world, that we need to keep them in mind as part of this as well. In order for there to be more youth equity in the world, the considerations of the built environment that we've looked at whether they're things that are being considered by architects, interior designers, city planners, developers, government officials, sort of everyone and anyone that helps shape the world around us and how people live, is we want to, at the same time, improve the conditions for youth, both locally and around the world. So one of the ways that we're doing that too in our program is through community engagement. And so part of the realization of how we can work towards, satisfying this quadruple bottom line is this sort of outreach and community engagement that we do, educating youth about the built environment, so that they're aware that they actually have a voice and they have a means of leverage in controlling the world around them. So our department participates with a group called SoCal NOMA, which is the Southern California chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects. And we participate in a variety of their programs to not only raise awareness to the youth that are involved in SoCal NOMA, but also to sort of reaffirm their ability to help shape the built environment around them and for them to be personally connected about it. So on this slide, this is a summer camp that participated in this last summer, where the campers learn about architecture and design. They design a building, and along the way, they learn about a lot of the sustainable design concepts that we talked about just today. So with that, I'm done with my part of the presentation. I'm going to hand the baton off to, we'll start with, I think, Viridiana Gonzalez, and she's going to introduce us to the project that her and Cristian are working on, and then we'll open up to the Q&A after that. Thank you.
Yes, yes, thank you, Jason. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, you guys can see everything? Okay, so I'll be briefly going over the bioclimatic housing project that we have been working with ITCA Institute in El Salvador. So essentially, College of the Canyons, in conjunction with ITCA Institute and El Salvador, are participating in an educational project aiming towards creating affordable, sustainable housing for low-income families. Prior collaboration between Habitat for Humanity and ITCA resulted in a first-of-its-kind bioclimatic house in El Salvador. Okay, so here pictured is the Campos Family Bioclimatic House, that is in San Miguel, El Salvador. And this bioclimatic building takes advantage and makes use of solar radiation, natural airflow for natural heating and passive cooling. So, give me a second. A few of these bioclimatic mechanisms that are incorporated in the home are the consideration of solar orientation, which has an impact on the building's orientation. And it's all essentially kind of interconnected to see how you're able to maximize the use of passive systems. So for example, the solar orientation impacts the orientation in order to make sure you make use of maximize the natural daylight entering the building without creating discomfort for the building occupants. And from there, it's also impacting the natural ventilation, and it's vital to get the optimum orientation in order to implement systems such as cross ventilation and the chimney effect, which the chimney effect incorporates cool air entering the building, absorbing the heat in the room, rising and exhaling from the top. There's also the incorporation of a green roof, which provides insulation, increases the biodiversity, reduces the heat island effect, the flooding, which is something to take into consideration since El Salvador does receive a lot of rain, and the ambient noises, and creating sustainable housing alternatives for low-income families. Further improve the overall quality of life of its inhabitants, providing comfort, security, and a sense of belonging. Okay. And as we move forward with the educational project with ITCA, we are taking the Campos Family Bioclimatic House a step further and looking to improve the building design through implementing new mechanisms such as energy efficiency, internal comfort, and the installation of renewable energies. With that, we've been researching the benefits of integrating performance analysis softwares into the early building design. In particular, Sapphire for SketchUp and Autodesk Insight for Revit. So performance-based design allows designers to understand the building early on and make better design decisions based on real-time feedback. Sapphire implements an iterative process which continually assesses how your building is performing, what is driving that performance, and when you can do it to influence it. Why is this important? It allows to quickly test out different design ideas within the 3D building environment. So essentially, you're able to see if moving the window orientation will allow for better ventilation or better daylight. And pictured here is the Sapphire extension in SketchUp. For this plugin, we are able to get a snapshot of the energy and daylight performance as the design evolves. We are able to answer questions such as how much energy your project is using per year, which building factors are driving that energy use, and how much daylight your building is receiving. As for the bioclimatic housing project, we'll be implementing it on a smaller scale using it for daylight and solar studies, evaluating the optimum building orientation, fenestration, as well as PV panel orientation. And I will go ahead and hand it off to Cristian to go over the insight.
So Cristian, I don't know if your microphone's plugged in.
Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Can you hear
Perfect.
me? Sorry about that. Let me start over. So thank you for going over it, Viridiana. I appreciate it. So now I'll go over Autodesk Insight. And essentially what I found out about Insight is that it's actually separated into 3 different aspects, which are solar analysis, lighting analysis, and energy analysis. Solar analysis and lighting analysis are all done within Revit environment, so within the program, and the energy analysis aspect of it is actually website centric, which like you saw in Viridiana's case, it has its own website when you can change sort of the wall insulation, you can change the window glazing, and you get like different energy costs and uses. So that's sort of what you get from the energy analysis. The focus that we would be going for this program would be its lighting analysis and solar analysis. And it's first separated into for the lighting analysis, it's separated into illuminance, daylight factor, daylight autonomy, LEED 2009, LEED before, and solar access, which would be focusing on only 4 shown in pink. And for the solar analysis, there's actually only 2, the photovoltaic analysis and the insulation analysis. So the photovoltaic is solar panels. And because these 2 are really important, we will be focusing on them as well. So let's start by explaining lighting analysis. And I'll just go over like the aspects of each one. Essentially, illuminance is the intensity of light reflected of objects in a scene and reaching your eye. So essentially, the accuracy of these results is wholly dependent on the materials used in the scene being analyzed. So for example, the materials used in like the glazing of window, the reflectivity from it, or if used in walls or even the floor will affect this analysis. So that's something you need to account for when you're building them all in Revit. the daylight factor. So this is actually used to assess the internal natural lighting levels as perceived on working planes or surfaces. Essentially, it's the percentage of illuminance compared to that on an unobstructed horizontal plane, like the one seen in roofs. The information is used to determine if light is sufficient for occupants to carry out normal activities. And let me go over LEED. And this is just a LEED analysis. It essentially goes over, it determines your design progress towards achieving LEED daylighting criteria. So if your building is qualified for being LEED certified, and it's just like a brief overview, it's not something too specific, but you get a sort of idea of it. For solar access, this actually determines the amount of daylight the building receives throughout the day. So for example, you see here, there's 0 hours up to 6 hours. You see sort of like the colors determining the amount of lighting it actually receives. And this would be a great tool to use in the upcoming project and creating and trying out different shading mechanisms for passive solar building designs. So for example, something like this is something simple I just created in Revit. Like you can go something more specific and something more realistic, but this can actually have effect in this analysis, and you can actually do shading sort of mechanisms, passive solar mechanisms, to create this, to get a sort of idea of what it actually affects on the building. Now I'll be focusing on solar analysis. And the photovoltaic analysis, it's essentially, as I said before, it's an analysis of solar panels. Sort of, you select the surface the solar panels will be at, and you essentially get information of sort of the energy savings you would get over the year, the amount of kilowatts you would receive over the years, and also the years it would take to get a payback. In this case, it would be 9.5 years to get a payback from attributing a solar panels to that surface. The insolation analysis is essentially the amount of solar radiation reaching a given area. So for example, I selected the whole building in this case, and you can see sort of the radiation that it's hitting on the surface, on certain surfaces. And you can also use passive solar sort of mechanisms like shading, trees, all that stuff to essentially achieve a better results. In this case, you can see that red over here, it's getting a lot of energy or solar radiation onto that surface. So you could provide essentially, in this case, it's good because we're gonna put photovoltaics in this part. So it's a good way that it's good that it's receiving so much solar radiation, but some other areas where there wouldn't be any, like for example, here, we could actually do some sort of green roof where we could add some plants or something like that, where we could alleviate some of that solar radiation. So now I'll be going over the ITCA El Salvador project Viridiana was talking about, and this is actually separated into two different phases. The first phase is actually starting from November, so this month, up until February of 2022. And the first step, which is separated into three steps, the first step is actually going over with faculty, and we will be discussing sort of the projects and different aspects, sort of interacting with them on different aspects we could build up on the project, either being aesthetic or something, a combination of aesthetic with something that actually affects the environment, like making it essentially LEED and all that, passive solar mechanisms. The ITCA and COC for step 2, it would be ITCA and COC faculty would conduct a report, a presentation at both institutions, summarizing the project progress and results thus far. So that would be due for February of 2022. And lastly, we will be actually going into a competition, an international competition called the Solar Decathlon. And it's actually a competition separated into 10 contests, which enter in the categories of either being a design or build challenge. We will be participating together with 79 other schools in the architecture contest with the design challenge. Phase 2 of the project is separated into 3 steps as well. And the first step is design chariot activity, which will be examining alternative building designs and construction ideas for future residence prototypes. relative to sustainable, resilient designs concepts. The second step would be students would work collaboratively to prepare LEED credit compliance documentation, as stated before, of proposed prototype for LEED for home certification. So sort of trying to make the building LEED compliant and making sure it essentially complies with that sort of aspect of the project. The third step would be ITCA and COC faculty would conduct a report out presentation at both institutions, sort of showcasing the further progress over the year, as well as to USGBC, Los Angeles, summarizing the project progress and results thus far. That would be the end of the presentation. Thank you for having us. Have a nice day.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I learned a lot, and I think there's hope for the future, but also a lot of challenges ahead. And we have some time here. I want to be mindful of folks' time, but I also want to give our audience a chance to ask some questions. So, and I have some questions, and I know we have some that popped up on the chat. But would anybody like to make a comment or question?
It's me. I mean, it's very depressing. The first part of Jason's presentation, sea level rises, and all this, and look at my house. This is doomed. But it gave me a lot of hope, especially with the students are so involved again, and they're working internationally with partner universities that we have in El Salvador. I applaud you for continuing the project, and I just can't wait to the presentation when the project is done. Excellent work. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Tim. I agree with Dr. J. Viridiana and Cristian are great foils to Jason's reality, and I really love that feeling of what the future holds with our students.
Could not agree more. Outstanding presentation. So one question I have is, and this is from the chat, but it seems like the United States is behind the curve in some key ways here in terms of sustainability and some of these projects that you mentioned. And you pointed out that you often look to places like Australia for some guidance and some ideas. Makes sense. What are some of the key roadblocks you see in the next few years? Political or NIMBYism or affordability? What are some of the things in the immediate future that we need to address in terms of challenges or roadblocks?
Well, I think it goes back to the principle of, and I'm speaking of the United States or just kind of our sort of local community. We actually suffer from being wealthy because we've always been able to sort of, sort of partition ourselves off from the world's problems. And it's one of those things where even if we see an impending disaster, we've always had the feeling that we'll have the science or we'll have the technology or we'll have the wealth to kind of get us out of it. And like in Australia, one of the things that although they're considered a wealthy country, they don't have water. And so there's nothing they can do but to be resourceful. And many other parts of the world, of course, it's the same thing. And so we're almost at a disadvantage because of our sort of luxury of how we've lived, sort of inertial momentum of our society over the last 100+ years. We've had access to water, we've had access to natural resources, and so as those things are becoming depleted, and particularly water is so acute in the Santa Clarita Valley. If you like one of the people that Dr. J and Tim and I interact with is works at the Santa Clarita Valley Water Group, and the conversations of how acute the water shortages are sobering, and it's one of those things that we obviously want to be optimistic because we don't want to be paralyzed by fear. But these problems are really right in front of us, and somebody's got to be the bad person, deliver the bad news, and so I guess that'll be me. But along with that, some of these techniques, the idea of simulation and modeling, some of the new technology, and then just some of the sort of community spirit that a lot of these sustainable design strategies incorporate. That's the part that really warms my heart, is that there are people that genuinely want to make a difference, and that's, I think, what will eventually move us in the right direction.
So to build on that, And I admire your balance of sober realism with optimism. I think that's the right path. But does limiting growth have to play a role here? I mean, whether it's population or urban sprawl. I mean, I love these ideas of rooftop gardens, but isn't growth really an issue here?
Yeah, and that's of course a complex issue, because where do you take that philosophically? Where do you take that argument? There's people that say we shouldn't, we should reduce our population. Well, how do you do that in a non-draconian way? One of the things that we teach our students is, and this is from a book that actually that we use as a textbook called Cradle to Cradle, and it looks at and emulates nature. And a lot of nature growth is not necessarily a thing about things getting bigger, but it's about the sort of cycles of resources, whether it's material resources or energy flows. And the problem that our society, our sort of heavy consumption society has, is that we have these what are actually called open loop cycles. We harvest something like a material and we consume it in whatever way we want to, and then we dispose of it. And that sort of one-way street of both physical materials and energy that's not sustainable. And again, that's where our sort of wealth has allowed us to do that. It's allowed us the luxury to just simply have. I mean, if you look at the volume of waste that each one of us on a weekly basis, generates, it's unbelievable. And then if you look at the scale of a city, and so why couldn't we find ways to reuse those resources in the way that nature does? Nature, if you think about a tree, nature creates leaves and seeds and fruit, and all this stuff grows and falls and decays, and then just gets basically reconstituted into the next round. So it's a sort of endless closed cycle of nutrients, and that we just simply haven't, on the scale of a society, figured out how to do that. And it's because of so many little issues. Some of them are political and economic, and so we suffer from like a death by 1,000 cuts. That like all these little things that we just can't seem to get in front of are what are causing the barriers. But there are optimistic things being done. And I think in our corner of the world as building designers, with Cristian and Viridiana and the other students in the program, what we're learning is that we actually do have quite a bit of leverage. Even though we work within the forces of the bureaucracy of codes and land use planning, and working for developers and people that maybe don't necessarily share the same sort of moral objectives that we do, we still can make a pretty tangible difference.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting too, because you're right. I think there's there's a tapestry of challenges and opportunities, and so trying to weigh all those is really difficult. Saab, I saw your hand up. Do you want to make an observation or a question?
Sure. I will make a couple of observations. I actually lived for 2 years in Australia. This was like 25 years ago. In fact, my wife had a child, and they didn't even have paper. They didn't use paper diapers. We had to use this recyclable, washable diapers, nappies, what they call it, because the disposable ones were just environmentally, terrible, and they were very, very environmentally conscious even back a quarter of a century ago. But also, people dry clothes outside, and we're talking about a pretty wealthy country. And I'm from Japan. We do the same thing back at home. Even with the high humidity, they try to dry, all the clothes every day outside. And I think Jason's absolutely right when he said that one of the curses of the United States, maybe it's wealth, because when I came to the States, I was quite surprised that people are using air conditioners when it wasn't even hot outside. They just blast it because they can. And I went to school in Michigan for 4 years, and there in the winter, inside the buildings were just extremely hot. You have to sort of dress in layers, because as soon as you go into the classroom, you have to take like everything off except your t-shirt, because they just overheat everything because it's so cold outside. And so I think the mentality or the mindset, hey, because we can control everything in the climate indoors, and we have enough energy to do so, and it's cheap, so let's go ahead and do this. Many of the houses, I think, that I saw in the United States were built in such a way that they had completely disregarded the directions where the sun comes from, when the wind flows. And to me, that was a big surprise because again, back home in Japan, every house is built with the ventilation and the sun, the direction of the sun in mind. So I do appreciate your ideas that you mentioned, especially with the emphasis on mathematics and geometry and angles and perpendicular and so on.
I figured you'd appreciate that.
Yeah. And I mean, just the basic science and the math background is so important. I have a friend who used to teach archaeology, architecture in a major university in Japan, and he was always lamenting the fact that his students can't do math and trigonometry. So, again, underscoring the importance of mathematical understanding and so on. So, thank you.
Thanks. I don't think Jason was going to talk about math until he saw you. And it felt like he really.
Well, and the beautiful thing and this is where the sort of luxury comes in, or the advanced technology that we do have access to, is that the computers now can obviously handle a lot of the heavy math loads. We as designers have to have a sort of intuitive and a general understanding of the fundamentals of physics and geometry and whatnot. But fortunately, the computers can do all the elaborate calculations, the real in-depth calculations that are needed, that Cristian and Viridiana were showing off.
So Brent, since you're a historian, I have to mention this. Thomas Jefferson was an architect, and he was very much of a master of mathematics. And yes. So there you
go. Absolutely. Designed the University of Virginia. That's right. And I'm glad you brought it into history. That's good. Jai, I think you have a question. You want to jump in here?
Yes. Jason mentions one book I think is extremely important and it's very readable, Cradle to Cradle. Not only that book is used in the architecture department, back in the days when I used to teach, I haven't been teaching for 8 years now, I used that book in my English 103 critical thinking class. And I also used that book in my humanities class. So I think the idea of basically, the design and also how we look at the material and how we go from one thing from the very beginning to the end, that book is quite invaluable. I would strongly encourage anyone who is in higher education or even, there's a very readable book. High school students, I think it's a very accessible book that would help them understand the overall construct of how sustainable development goals set out by UN that Jason shared at the very beginning, how that's actually achievable and what everyone's role is in that. And I think as educators, what we care about the most is how, when we have a goal, right? Either is no poverty or no hunger, whatever that is, right? How we as educators can integrate and infuse it into our teaching and the campus climate to be able to let people feel this is part of me, this is part of what I live. So I don't longer have to think about this is the goal that we're going to achieve. We want that goal to become reality sooner than later.
So I have a question about sort of how the pandemic might relate to some of these things. Because I was thinking about when we were talking about the future of commercial property, for instance, in cities like Los Angeles. And you can imagine an environment where work from home continues to expand. You can imagine an environment where e-commerce, digital commerce continues to expand with things like Amazon, no matter how we might feel about these developments. So is it possible to convert some of this commercial property into green spaces? Is there the political will to do that? Is there the design feasibility there? Do you have any thoughts on kind of moving forward in that area?
Yeah, and those discussions are being had and have been had over the last 18 months. And they're part of a longer continuum of the virtualization of our society. A lot of what drives development is profit. And so we're seeing trends, obviously a lot of profit can be had in housing, which is one of our deficiencies. We just simply don't have affordable housing for many people. And so, but we also have a decrease in like brick and mortar retail stores. And so one of the trends is obviously converting what would have been retail in a lot of these large malls into habitable spaces, whether it's apartments, condos, or tearing parts of buildings down or repurposing them in some way. But where the whole idea of the sort of hybrid work environment is going is, I I think it's just simply expanding, and we're seeing this in academia. Obviously, it's not just that, oh, we used to do things this way and this way. Well, we're still going to do them this way and this way, but we also now have these other modes. And so I think that the work environment is going to follow the same thing, that there's going to be an expansion of the ways people work. We're obviously going to be doing, Zoom type of stuff going forward, whether people do that at home or at some other dedicated workspace or some sort of a flex office space, they rent by the hour. That's obviously something that's increasing in demand. And it's really kind of market driven. I mean, hopefully it ultimately uses less resources, but it's tied to how we transport ourselves. We've never had a strong public transit system in Southern California. It's always been resisted and shortchanged and never really been able to get off the ground. But like transportation affects so many things about where we live, where we work. And so it's sort of tied to that, and people in their individual lives make decisions about how they're going to make the best of what opportunities they have. And one of the things is like affordability housing. The other thing is transportation to get to where they need to work, where they can, shop and educate themselves, recreate, all that kind of stuff. So I guess to answer your question, it's going to be a hot mess for a while as far as transforming our built environment to accommodate these new ways of working and recreating and going out, getting food. We have the idea that food can come to you now. I mean, we've always had delivery of food, but now it's being changed. The scale of it's being changed.
So we have a few minutes left. I want to be mindful of our time here, but are there any questions from anyone else from our audience today? Any other issues we want to tackle here? There's so much to think about here, and this is like a lot of these topics. This affects all of us. Oh, Flavio has a question here. I'll read Flavio's question. This is a good one. For students who want to follow a career path in sustainability, what colleges and universities are known for these types of programs to explore? That's a great question. Thanks, Flavio.
And that's, an interesting thing that both Viridiana and Cristian are looking into themselves. A lot of our other students, as they look to transfer or make their entryway into the profession. I kind of fell into sustainability by accident, in a sense. I, started off at Pierce College wanting to learn architecture, and then I couldn't afford to go to USC and study architecture, so I ended up in Colorado, and lo and behold, it was an environmental design program. And so there are a lot of schools in California that teach, architecture with an emphasis on sustainability. So it could be like Cal Poly Pomona, it could be the UCs, both Berkeley and UCLA have really strong programs. A lot of our students go to Woodbury University in Burbank as well. So they have a really strong program. They've actually just started up a sustainable construction program there, which is really interesting. But it also, a lot of it you learn not just simply in school, but by networking, interacting. So we encourage our students to participate with the US Green Building Council, which has a local LA chapter that's one of the most active in the country. And that's where we not only learn about sustainable practices, but start meeting the people that are actually doing them day to day in their work, whether they are designers or developers or contractors or consultants of some kind. So that networking is just as important as the sort of educational aspect of it.
Thanks, that's great. I love this conversation. Fantastic presentation, and something for all of us to think about going ahead, moving forward here. Before we go, we like to hear your thoughts on all of our sessions, and so I think we have a quick poll that we want to launch here. There we go. So if you could answer these questions, and then we'll call it a day from there.
I did see another question just came up. I don't know if we have time or not, but I think it's a pretty good question.
Yeah, from Ryan. Is there a specific aspect of sustainable design that you see developing at a fast rate? Yeah, that is a good one.
Yeah, and I think in addition to things we talked about, one of the ones that's really critical is the idea of on-site energy generation. I think it ties into the resiliency of our communities, that we're not simply reliant on utility scale energy generation, that we can particularly here in Southern California, where we have such high levels of solar irradiance. You know, the amount of solar energy that's hitting our area is some of the best in the world. And so whether it's through photovoltaic solar panels or other forms like wind turbines or geothermal energy generation, I see that being an important part of integrating into a project. And I know that Cristian and Viridiana are going to be exploring that as part of the ICA project we'll be working on going forward.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everyone. This was a great discussion, great presentation. I want to thank Jason and Viridiana and Cristian for their contributions today. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks again. And we will hope to see all of you at our next session, which is at 2 o'clock. We're going to have a discussion on workforce development and all the things going on in that area. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.